Professor Lewis is recognized as perhaps the world's leading authority in Islam today. He's authored some 30 books and hundreds of articles. I even think more than 1,000 articles. I was doing the math today, Bernard. And you haven't counted? Don't just go to Google. If you go to Google, it's kind of like going into Professor Lewis's home. It's amazing. Thousands and thousands of sources written over the last 70 years of professional life, thinking about the tough questions that Islam poses and the Arab world poses to all of us and to itself. And I must tell you that between 1941 and 1945, Professor Lewis served in Her Majesty's Service, British Intelligence Agency's Middle East Desk. From 74 to 76, he was the Cleveland Dodge Professor of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton. And, of course, many of you know him for his best-selling books, Crisis of Islam and What Went Wrong, which have been translated into some 20-some-odd languages, including Farsi and Indonesian. And I must tell you, just as a personal anecdote, that many Arab leaders and academics whom I've been able to come into contact with in the region are all wait for Professor Lewis to visit the area so that they have a chance to sit with him as well. And so let's get into it quickly because we don't have much time and we have much to learn. It's good that they have two comfortable chairs here, Professor Lewis. I had actually asked for a couch that I could lie down on because the region's so crazy right now. There's really more questions than answers. I mean, there are some who say that there are no conflicts that can't be solved, and there are others that don't have answers. And the first question that I have is, or we have perhaps, if I'm speaking on behalf of everyone here, is what is going on in this recent conflict, latest conflict? You had three major Arab powers publicly condemning the Hamas and, in a way, silently expressing some support for Israel. What's going on, Bernard?
I think what we are seeing is a recurrence of what I think I would call the Sadat Gambit. Let me remind you of what happened with Sadat. Sadat didn't make peace with Israel because he was suddenly persuaded of the merits of the Zionist case. It was a quite different reason. What drove Sadat towards peace was the growing awareness on his part and on the part of the Egyptians generally that Egypt was becoming a Soviet colony. I was in Egypt quite frequently in the late 60s and early 70s, and I saw for myself that the Soviet presence had become more obvious and to Egyptians more offensive than the British presence had been in the last phase of the British occupation of Egypt, which I can also recall from the earlier part of my long life. He tried to deal with it in other ways through Washington, but Washington responded with the Vance-Gromyko agreement, which was in effect handing Egypt back to the Russians. And he therefore decided that on the worst estimate of Israel's intentions and on the best estimate of Israel's power, Israel was less dangerous than the Soviets, and of course that was true. That was what led him to make peace. And it has endured since, a peace that is at best cool and sometimes frosty, but it has held. What I think we are seeing now is a similar phenomenon. The danger that they see this time is not the Soviet Union, which has disappeared, but the multiple dangers presented by Iran. And this comes in several forms. One is what you might call the Iranian imperial danger. Iran, unlike most of the countries of this region, is a real nation with a history and a self-awareness going back not just centuries, but millennia. It figures quite prominently in Jewish history, as you may recall. And we have two images of Iran in the Jewish memory, one typified by Haman, the other by Cyrus. Both are visible at the present time, though Haman seems to be dominant. Let me come back to my point. Iran is once again stretching out westward and eastward. Eastward to Afghanistan, Pakistan, westward, which concerns us more particularly, across the Middle East towards the Mediterranean. This comes in several forms. one of them, I just mentioned what you might call the Iranian imperial. The second is the Shiite threat. Now, Islam has been almost since its beginning divided into two major sectarian groups, the Sunnis and the Shia. The Sunnis form the overwhelming majority, and in countries where there are only Sunnis and no Shia, the difference is unimportant. They're hardly aware of it. Where it is important is where Sunni and Shia meet, and particularly in countries where you have Sunni dominance of Shia populations, a situation for which I would borrow a word from Irish history and call it a Sunni ascendancy. The most notable is Iraq. Iraq has had a Shia majority as far back as we can trace the history, and it has remained under the rule of the Sunni minority through ancient times, medieval times, Ottoman times, under the British, under the monarchy, and under the various rules that have followed them. Only now, for the first time, there is a Shia majority government in Iraq. And the links with Iran are obviously a matter of deep concern. Going beyond Iraq, there are significant Shia populations in Syria, in Kuwait, in Bahrain, in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia, and elsewhere in that region. And now, for the first time in many centuries, they see Shiism as a serious threat, a mortal threat to the Sunni ascendancy which has prevailed in the Middle East since time immemorial. What makes this threat even worse is that it is linked with what one might call the revolutionary aspect of the Iranian regime. The word revolution is much used in the Middle East. It's the only generally accepted title to legitimacy. But most of the regimes which call themselves revolutionary, which came to power by what they call a revolution, I think could be better described as by the French term coup d'etat or the German putsch. English history happily provides no equivalent. Excuse me, could I have some water? Thank you. Thanks. The Iranian Revolution is a genuine revolution, resembling in some ways the French and the Russian revolutions, and showing some of the same features. I'm sorry. The internal struggle between moderates and extremists, the terror, the vast impact on the whole world with which they share a common universe of discourse. And now I think, following the French model and the Russian model, we might say that the Iranian Revolution is entering what you might call the Napoleonic or the Stalinist phase.
So that means you want to make that point?
I just finished the point.
Please.
Now, this obviously represents a mortal threat to the established regimes in the region. A threat far more deadly, far more dangerous, far more profound than anything that Israel could offer, even on the worst estimate of Israel's intentions. And that is why, like Sadat in his day, but for even more compelling reasons this time, they are looking to Israel for help in dealing with what they see as the major threat. Thank you.
Professor Lewis, if Iran, as you say, is racing for regional supremacy and upending, destabilizing Arab regimes with the same energy that it intends to destroy Israel, what does that mean for places like Gaza and the West Bank? Are they, to what extent are they part of the Iranian plan, or how should we think about the closer battlefields to home?
Yes, I think one might divide them into two groups. On the one hand, you have the groups that are themselves Shia. Shia are an important part of the population of Syria and Lebanon. Hezbollah is a Shiite organization, so their link with Iran and with the Iranian Revolution is clear and obvious. There are no Shia Palestinians. And as I said before, where the distinction doesn't exist, it's not important. That is why it is possible for groups of people in Muslim Africa, which is solidly Sunni, or among the Palestinians who are solidly Sunni, to take up the Iranian cause. And that is why I think we find that Hamas has accepted support from Iran and is rallying to the Iranian cause because for them, in their historical religious awareness, the Sunni-Shiite difference is not that important.
So therefore, on balance, because there's a major debate, Professor Lewis, that has been going on about this conflict, meaning in a narrow sense the Palestinian-Israeli conflict as a part of a subset of the Arab-Israeli conflict, that we're really in an ethno-national conflict, some say, we're in a political conflict, some say, but from what you're saying, to what extent are we really in a religious conflict?
I think that in the Muslim perception, it's basically a religious conflict. It is to decide who will dominate Islam, whose version of Islam will prevail in the Islamic world. And there is no doubt that the Iranians have plans going far beyond the Middle East, extending eastwards into South and Southeast Asia, westwards into Muslim Africa. And there are signs of that in various places. The impact has been enormous. As I said, it had the same kind of impact as the French and Russian revolutions in their days, with the same kind of response. There is one other point, which I think I will mention, if you would allow me. And that is what I would call the apocalyptic aspect. In Islam, as in Judaism, as in Christianity, there is a scenario for the end of time, when the final battle takes place between the forces of good and the forces of evil, which for Christians, Jews and Muslims alike means between us and them, the us and being differently defined, the them being more or less the same. In the Muslim view, no, and let me correct that. In the view of a certain section within the Iranian leadership, it's not by any means unanimous, that time is now. For a group called the Hojatiyah, whose main leader is Ahmadinejad, the apocalyptic time has come. The Mahdi, the Muslim Messiah, is already here. The final battle between the forces of good and the forces of evil has already begun. That is extremely important for another, not immediately related reason. And that is the question of Iran's nuclear weapon. The Soviet Union had nuclear weapons right through the Cold War, but neither side used them because both sides were aware that if either one did, the other would do the same, and this would lead to mutual destruction. MAD, as it was known at the time, mutual assured destruction, was the main deterrent preventing the use of nuclear weapons by the Soviets. For most of the Iranian leadership, MAD would work as a deterrent. But for Ahmadinejad and his group, with their apocalyptic mindset, mutual assured destruction is not a deterrent, it's an inducement. They believe that the end of time has come. The final battles are already beginning, and the sooner the better, so that the good can go to enjoy the delights of paradise in the divine brothel in the sky, and the wicked, and that means all of us here, can go to eternal damnation.
On this point of Iranian ascendancy and dedication to the end of days, you have written, especially since 1976, when you wrote The Return of Islam, exactly 2 years before the Islamic Revolution in Iran, first Islamic Revolution in Iran. Many in the West of your colleagues have not seen it the way you've seen it. They have
not immediately.
You have expressed concern in your writings, from the return of Islam to the roots of Muslim rage, yes, even to other more recent articles, that the West is not getting something about Islam. What are they missing?
It is normal for human beings to judge others by ourselves. We are now in the 21st century of the Christian era. They are in the early 15th century of the Muslim era. It's a different religion based on entirely different historical experience, different message, different teaching. And it is therefore a grave error to do what people normally do, and that is judge others by ourselves. It doesn't work, and it's dangerously misleading. If one looks at Islam from within, For that, it's necessary to learn at least one Muslim language, something which many Middle East experts, in fact most Middle East experts in the West, for one reason or another, are reluctant to do. If one learns the languages and reads what they say among themselves and understands it in the context of their own history, their own culture, their own background, then I think it's not too difficult to understand what is happening.
Then why is it, if Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, the Palestinian Authority and the West Bank are publicly condemning Iran and their servants, their Sunni and Shiite servants, shall we call them, or proxies or surrogates, why is the Arab establishment unwilling to fight when they are so frightened of what they perceive as an existential threat to them?
Because the Arab establishment, as you call it, consists mainly of rather unpopular autocracies. I mean, looking at it from a Western point of view, if you look around the Middle East, you could divide the countries into two groups. Countries with pro-Western, let's be more specific, countries with pro-American governments and therefore anti-American populations, and countries with anti-American governments and therefore pro-American populations. The second consisting essentially of Iran. We and the West are seen as the sponsors, the aiders and abettors of the tyrannies that rule over them. Now, I said a moment or two ago that the regimes now in these countries, the rulers of Egypt and others, see the threat and are therefore turning to Israel. That does not mean that the populations of those countries see it that way or are turning to Israel. Take the specific case of what's been happening in Gaza. Mubarak and his government and his whole ruling apparatus feel mortally threatened by the pro-Iranian presence in the Gaza Strip and are very happy to see it demolished. But that is not the case with a large part of the Egyptian population. I mean, the Hamas people in Gaza are a part of the Muslim Brothers. The Muslim Brothers constitute a very significant opposition group within Egypt and the Egyptian population. And there too, since the Sunni-Shia business is not important, the revolutionary appeal, even the apocalyptic appeal of Shiism has some impact.
Professor Lewis, what we've seen with the emergence of the communications revolution in Arab countries are a lot of brave attempts, one might call them, to criticize regimes on television, yes, in newspapers, and on the internet. Why is that happening now, and what's the prospect for that type of opposition? Is that Muslim Brother opposition? Is that, can one argue that there are democracy and freedom oppositionaires as well?
Yeah. The communications revolution has had a tremendous impact. In the past, the Muslim world was, on the whole, I would say, rather better situated than the Western world regarding communication. Even in the pre-modern era, the annual pilgrimage, which brought Muslims together from all over the Muslim world, gave them a feeling of common identity and common awareness without parallel in the Western world until comparatively modern times. The mosque, the minaret, the preacher gave them a medium of communication free from censorship and again with a wide impact without parallel in the pre-modern Western world. With the advent of modern communications, all that has changed. Now they have even more than that on a much vaster scale. Radio, television, internet, and the rest of it now operating on a vast scale all over the Islamic world, including, and this is the part that I find both interesting and encouraging, including Iran. And there is growing evidence that a large part, probably the majority of the population in Iran, are thoroughly fed up with the regime that rules them. This appears in a number of ways, partly through websites, through communication directly by telephone, and in other ways. It's well expressed in what is probably the most reliable indicator of political trends in the Middle East, generally in autocratic regimes, the political joke. Let me give you a couple of examples from Iran. Two Iranians are discussing how dreadful the situation is in their country. This is bad, that's worse, this is terrible, that's awful. And finally one says to the other, what we need in this country is to bring Osama bin Laden here. And the other one turns to him in horror and said, what, are you crazy? And the first one said, no, then the Americans would come. Now that is an authentic Iranian joke communicated from Iran. It tells you something. Another one, at the time when President Bush launched his attack on Iraq, a lot of people telephoned from Iran to say, you should have tackled your problems in alphabetical order.
By the way, in the first reorganization of the Arab world, you coined a phrase for what happened in Kuwait when Iraq conquered that country. What did you call it?
Really?
You won't get out of this. Do you remember what you said? What did you say?
I said that the operation should be renamed. Instead of Desert Storm, it should be called Kuwaitus Interruptus.
Now that's a positive note. We want to. I want to.
My specialty is the Middle East, not the Middle West.
But this means something for Israel. What you've said here, and I don't want to let this slip, is that if Israel is being sought after, in a sense, by the Arab world, what does that mean about Israel's own perception of itself in terms of being a regional player as opposed to a bilateral player against the Palestinians, which has been the definition, its own self-definition, very much so until today?
I think Israel needs to redefine itself in accordance with contemporary realities.
Which means?
That's for Israelis to decide.
How about the longer view, Bernard? You know, let me just mention something. That you've written some 30 books, and for some reason, for some good reason, you've just written a book. It's just sort of hot off the press, if you will, with a dear friend of many, many years and a colleague, Bunsie Ellis Churchill, who is here. Bunsie, just raise your hand so everyone says hello. And this book is called Islam, the Religion and the People. Now, this book comes probably before you've hit your sweet spot in your career, Bernard. You have another 30 or 40 or 50 years, we're sure. But the question is, why the focus on this book now on the religion of Islam, which is where you focused your attention?
Because Islam is very much the topic of the moment. We are dealing with this revolutionary movement in Iran, which defines itself and is indeed defined as an Islamic movement. That's to say, with a challenge to the whole world of Islam. We are in a time when Islam is challenging the Western world in a way that it hasn't done since the early Middle Ages. Remember that in the perception of Muslims at the present day, and of the Western world in earlier times, but no longer today, there has been a cosmic struggle going on for centuries and indeed for a couple of millennia between the two world religions, Christianity and Islam. A struggle that has gone backwards and forwards. The Muslims came out of Arabia and invaded and conquered a large part of the Christian world. The Middle East, North Africa, all parts of Christendom then, and then into Europe, southern Italy, Spain, Portugal, a bit of France. But Europe reacted, drove them back. Second attempt, the Ottomans. They conquered Anatolia, which was then a Christian land, Constantinople, which was then a Christian city, invaded the Balkan Peninsula, conquered all of it, and advanced twice as far as Vienna. And again they were driven back. But then, like the Arabs in North Africa, they retained part of their conquests, but lost most of Europe. Many people in the Muslim world see this as, shall we say, third time lucky. The third, and as they hope, the final attempt by the Muslims to bring their holy war into the land of the unbelievers, and after two partly but not finally successful attempts to complete the job. And in that context, we see what is happening in Europe as an essential phase of that. Through the double factors of demography and migration, certainly the progress of Islam in Europe, helped by the willingness of so many Europeans to submit, is making impressive progress.
What you wrote in 1990, a watershed article called The Roots of Muslim Rage. Now, it was just 36 months before the first World Trade Center attack. And the question of the roots of Muslim rage, how do we understand it today? Is it modernity? Is it Christianity? Is it Christendom, as it were? And how should the West respond to that rage?
I think one thing is important to point out, that in the Muslim world, particularly in the Arab world, they have a very strong sense of history, a very strong awareness of history, without parallel in the modern West. Probably you're better situated here. In America, the ignorance of history is quite appalling. If you say that's history, you mean it's finished, over and done with, and of no current importance. And from time to time, as I say, one is appalled at the level of ignorance even among university students. Now, in the Muslim world generally, they have a very strong sense of history. That doesn't mean to say that their history is necessarily very accurate. That's not the point. But there is this strong awareness. For example, during the 8-year war that was fought between Iraq and Iran, two Muslim countries, both carried on extensive propaganda addressed to their own people and to the enemy populations. And the propaganda from both sides was full of historical allusions. And I mean allusions. They didn't tell stories from history. They would mention a name, a date, a place from 14 centuries ago, in the certain awareness that these references would be picked up and understood. Now, I can't imagine that happening in Europe at the present time. It does happen there. This sense of awareness is very important, and I think it's very much in evidence at the present time. They talk of the first attempt when they made progress and were driven back. They talk of the second attempt when they made progress and were driven back, and now the third. Well, what's the difference now? Each time they were driven back by some new European force. The Byzantines, the European empires. In the modern period, they confronted two rival powers in the world of the unbelievers, which means the world of non-Islam. Osama bin Laden puts it very clearly and very eloquently in his writings that this struggle has been going on for more than 13 centuries. The Islamic world was ruled by successive dynasties of caliphs from successive capitals: Medina, Damascus, Baghdad, Cairo, Istanbul. The world of the unbelievers was ruled by successive emperors or equivalent in various capitals. In the final phase, he says, the world of the unbelievers was divided, disputed between two rival superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. In Afghanistan, he says, we, meaning the Muslims, we defeated and destroyed the more deadly and the more dangerous of the two. Dealing with the Americans will be comparatively simple and comparatively easy. This is the perception which I think motivates the jihadists of the present time. The feeling that this is the final phase of the millennial struggle. They have defeated one of the final two superpowers. They are driving back the other. They are taking over Europe, and the next step is to take over the rest of the world. This outlook is very clearly expressed, and it is linked with the millennial apocalyptic view which I mentioned earlier.
Then let's look at the symmetrical case in the West. The West's experience in the Middle East has not really been all that positive since 1979. In other words, attempts to confront, approach Islam, radical Islam, have not succeeded. Why is that, and what's missing in the analysis of the West?
Well, I think the first thing that's missing in the analysis is an awareness of what we confront, and a more accurate perception of what is happening, of what the different forces are within the Islamic world, I think would be a helpful beginning. The second, I think, is a lack of awareness of the magnitude of the threat. A tendency to see this in old-fashioned terms as some sort of colonial war or some local trouble. It isn't. It's much more than that.
Professor Lewis, let me go back to Iran for a moment and talk about Iranian imperialism and its use of genocidal talk of incitement against Israel in the context of its desire for and its intention to achieve regional supremacy. Can we say, what is the role, let's say, of genocide within Iran's imperial designs? Can it be compared to some sort of Nazi behavior in the past?
Well, genocide is not part of the Muslim scenario for the end of time. Yes, there will be final struggles against Jews and Christians and other non-Muslims, but this kind of genocidal approach, I don't think has precedence in the earlier period. What we do find, certainly, there's no lack of negative or anti-Jewish traditions of the Prophet, and there are various passages in the Quran and traditions which can be cited to that effect. But this is a new one, and I think is obviously connected with the existence of the State of Israel.
And to begin to wind down here, you have given us some reason for worry tonight, some concern. There's concern in the air.
Yes.
Now, having said that, you have been a proponent of some optimistic assessments with some historical precedent about democracy and freedom in the Arab world.
Yes.
Where are we today in terms of the mix of optimism and pessimism of Professor Lewis when it comes to the possibility of democracy and freedom in the Arab world?
Well, I mentioned before what I call the Sadat Gambit. That's to say, of some rulers in the Middle East deciding to make peace and even seeking some sort of relationship with Israel because they fear a greater danger, which led to the peace treaties with Egypt, with Jordan, and to less formal relations with some other Arab states. That is what is happening now. That is which may affect even as improbable a country as Saudi Arabia, which seems to be looking for, shall we say, some measure of understanding. That leads to cold peace, which is better than no peace, but it's uncertain, and one never knows where it will go. The other thing which I see as more hopeful is what I'm tempted to call the Sharansky effect. The spread of the idea of democracy in our own Western form of it to places where previously it would have been inconceivable. It is still small scale, it is limited, and for obvious reasons it is very dangerous to express. But there are signs. We find people like Mithal al-Alusi in Iraq, who suffered a terrible loss. His children were killed because he visited Israel. Nevertheless, he continues to speak of the need for good relations with Israel and holds up Israel as an example of functioning democracy. And there are others too, in other Muslim countries, in other Arab countries besides Iraq. They are not many, and for obvious reasons they don't speak out very often. They'd have to be very careful, but they do exist. I know some of them, I've spoken with some of them, sometimes in their own countries, sometimes when traveling, sometimes by telephone. There are various ways. It's still limited, it's precarious, but it's happening. And that, I think, is probably the best hope for the future, because these people, and there are a number of them, are very appreciative of Israel. I've sat with people watching Israeli television in Arab countries, and they see an Arab member of parliament stand up in Parliament, denounce the government, its members, its policies and its actions, and then go home safely. They see this happening in Israel and shown on Israeli television. The impact of this is enormous. This is something beyond their experience, and it really does have an effect. I remember once an Arab boy who must have been about 12 or 13 years old had his wrist broken by an Israeli soldier or policeman, and he appeared next day with his wrist bandaged, denouncing Israeli brutality on Israeli television. I was watching this in Jordan. With me was an Iraqi. That was when Saddam Hussein was still in power. An Iraqi who had fled from Iraq to Jordan. And he looked at this in utter bewilderment and said, Wallahi, he said, I would gladly let Saddam Hussein break both my arms and both my legs if he would let me talk like that on television. These people are not stupid. They see it. Another example comes to mind. When Sadat came to Jerusalem and gave his famous speech to the Knesset, he was accompanied by 2 Egyptian guards who were with him all the time. When Sadat spoke, the Knesset was absolutely silent. You could hear a pin drop. When he finished and Begin spoke, the Knesset reverted to its normal behavior. Telephone calls, cat calls, conversations, interruptions, people coming and going. A friend of mine was standing next to the 2 Egyptian guards who looked at this in utter bewilderment. And one said to the other, I'll give it to you in Egyptian Arabic for those of you who understand. One said to the other, Da'ida, what is this? And the first one said, Demokratia, this is democracy. And the first one said, Wallahi haga hilwa awi, a very sweet thing.
There's nothing else to say after that. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Professor Bernard Lewis.